So hello, welcome to everyone who's joining the Navigating Human Resources webinar. We are going to wait just a minute or two as a few more folks join. All right, so I'm going to do a little welcome and introduction. My name is Amanda Gerke. I'm with the City of Alameda's Community Development Department. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on navigating human resources during COVID-19. I'd like to introduce you all and welcome our speakers and panelists today. We're welcoming Erica Frank from the California Chamber of Commerce. She's going to give a presentation about some of the topics. And then Cherie Corfy is with both with Alameda's Chamber of Commerce. She is the chair-elect for their board. And then she is also with Zap Payroll, a company that focuses on providing human resources assistance for small businesses. So we are going to start with a presentation from Erica. Before we start, I just wanted to give a couple technical notes. So we're going to have a lot of time for Q&A. That really is the focus of this presentation. If you have Q&A you would like to share, please enter it under the Q&A section. So on the bottom of your screen, there's a little bar, and there'll be a spot there where you can enter questions and answers, and we'll try to get to all of the questions that you have. We've got all the attendees on mute at this point so that we can keep the focus on the presenters. So if you're having any technical issues, feel free to put that under the chat function or the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to help you with that. We are recording this webinar, and we're going to be posting it on the city's website afterwards. And then we'll also be sending out an email to everyone who registered with a link to that recording, so you guys can view it again or share it with your colleagues. Yeah, I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erica with the California Chamber of Commerce.
Great.
Erica, take it away.
Thank you. And welcome everybody to this webinar. I know that right now there's still a lot of uncertainty and questions, and I'm going to share my screen here so we can talk about furloughs and some of the leaves that we have available. I'm going to just start this from the beginning. Okay. All right, here we go. I'm Erica Frank. I'm Executive Vice President and General Counsel over at the California Chamber of Commerce, and we're going to talk about furloughs, layoffs, and emergency leaves amid the COVID-19. Just a quick little disclaimer, of course, I'm an attorney, but we do ask that you not rely upon any of the information I'm giving to you today as legal advice. This presentation the recording of it will be posted on the website afterwards, which is fantastic. If you are looking to obtain a copy of the presentation, you will need to let me know or the Chamber of Commerce know. Okay, we've heard a lot about the difference between furloughs and layoffs. And a lot of individuals don't really know the difference. Is there a difference? And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the differences of the two, clarify their terminology, and provide some tips on it. So a furlough is actually a term of art. It was utilized by the government during the 2008 recession. It's really not applicable in the private sector, but because it's become such a common term, the term furlough has been heavily used during this COVID-19 crisis. What it basically is just an unpaid leave of absence. So it's temporary in time. The employee still remains on your payroll. They just don't have work to do. And a lot of employers shifted to a furlough type layoff, if you will, because they knew this was going to be temporary, or they were hoping that this would be temporary. And they wanted to make sure that they had employees available when they were ready to come back to work. So it all seems fine as far as telling your employees, look, we're not terminating you, we're not firing you, we're keeping you on the payroll, we're just sending you home because there's no work to be done. The problem, however, in California is there still is a final pay issue, and that's because under the Department of the Labor Commissioner's Office, or the DLSC, their enforcement policies and interpretations manual, as well as a couple of opinion letters out there, basically say that if the employee does not come back to work during that pay period, they are due all their accrued wages, vacation, and sick. So the reason that this is important to raise is when we have a termination, we'll talk about it in a moment, rules that employers have to follow. And those final paycheck rules include paying the employee out for all accrued time, vacation time, all pay that they might have earned. Sick leave is generally not paid out unless an employer has by policy that they'll pay out any of their accrued sick time. So with the furlough, the idea is the individuals are still on our payroll, so why should we have to pay out any accrued vacation? And for a lot of employers, especially some of the small businesses, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States and hit California, and all of a sudden we had these mandates to close, there wasn't enough cash flow for these businesses to actually pay their employees out any accrued time. Now, the Labor Commissioner's Office is aware of this. The California Chamber of Commerce has been working with the governor and the Labor Commissioner's Office to provide some clarification or relief on this issue, but we haven't received any yet. What some lawyers are encouraging their employees to do, and if this is something that you are interested in doing, please check with legal counsel about it, is offering the employee the ability to have their accrued time paid out or offer them the ability not to have it. So you're leaving the choice onto the employee as to whether or not they want their vacation paid out now if they're being furloughed. So I talked a little bit about this. Why do some employers want that furlough? Well, again, it's about employee retention. We're keeping them on the payroll. The other reason, and the other strategic reason, is we don't have to onboard them back when they come back. So we're giving them basically a temporary leave or a temporary layoff. And that's what some lawyers are going to talk about is there's no such thing as furlough. Instead, it's a temporary layoff. It's temporary in time. So we don't have to go ahead and go through all those onboarding processes of getting the Form I-9, filling out all the documentation, providing all the pamphlets. Also, in many cases, there's a continuation of health benefits. And again, this is something that each employer needs to confirm with their carrier as to whether or not their insurance carrier will allow the continuation of health benefits to somebody who is on the payroll but is not working at the time. Now, something to point out, and most of us probably already know this, is the UI benefits that are afforded and available to employees during this COVID-19 pandemic is way more than what is normally offered. And what I mean by that is there is the ability to collect UI benefits if your work hours have been reduced, if you are no longer able to work because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we've seen in the news reports, the unemployment insurance claims have just hit the sky. We're seeing unprecedented numbers, not just in California, but nationwide. A layoff is a termination of employment, and that's really the distinction between a furlough or temporary layoff and a layoff. That's the only way I could really distinguish the two. Usually with a layoff, whether we're in COVID-19 situation or not, it means that there's either no more work or the position is no longer needed. As with normal terminations, we do have those final pay rules that I briefly talked about, and I'll talk about it again in a moment. UI benefits are also available. The thing, however, that most employers need to be aware of is if we start to look at a reduction in force or a mass layoff, so when we start to talk about a number of individuals, then we might have some notification requirements under federal and state law. These are called the WARN notices. So federal WARN and then California WARN, which is oftentimes called the baby WARN. So under the federal WARN, there is a business disruption exception. Such does not exist under California's baby WARN. So under normal circumstances, an employer that employs or have employed 75 or more full-time or part-time workers in the preceding 12 months do need to provide a 60-day notice, and that's a 60-day advance notice, letting those employees know that there will be a mass layoff, relocation, or cessation of industrial or commercial operations. Now, with the COVID-19 pandemic, there was no 60-day notice. There was no ability for employers to plan. Everything just came to a crashing halt within a matter of days. So the Governor Newsom several weeks ago did issue an executive order that relaxed the WARN Act notice. What the order did is said, okay, we're not going to require that 60-day advance notice, but you're still going to have to notify your employees, and you're going to have to notify them with as much notice as possible. So whatever that might mean as far as how much notice an employer can give to their employees. I have here a link to the Department of Industrial Relations website that does include FAQs on this modified COVID-19 specific Cal WARN executive order that Governor Newsom issued. So speaking of planning and providing those employees some advance notice, especially at a time like this where there isn't a whole lot of time to plan, it can be very tricky. Even when it's tricky, however, and if we're looking at more, or we look at that we're going to be needing to lay off not just 1 or 2 individuals, but maybe 5, 10, 15, whatever the number might be, we do want to make sure that we're utilizing objective criteria to determine which employees are included. We want to be careful about those employees that are in what we call a protected class. So that could be somebody who's over the age of 40, because over the age of 40 is a protected class. Somebody who might have a medical condition or is on disability, or perhaps is on an FMLA leave while this is all going on. So we want to make sure that in selecting who will be laid off or what positions will be laid off, that we're using objective criteria that is driven by the business necessity. Now, like I talked about here, determining whether federal or state WARN Acts apply, that's going to be something that goes into that planning equation as well. Final pay requirements, and then always consulting with legal counsel as you're going through the planning process. And of course, oftentimes what happens when we are looking at a reduction in force or even a layoff situation, is there the opportunity to provide some kind of severance to some of your employees? If so, what does that severance look like? How are you calculating the severance? Is there a formula that's going to be used? And then crafting that severance agreement as well. On the final paycheck rules, this slide is very nice because it really outlines what the rules are, because there's timing requirements. So if an employer terminates an employee, that final paycheck is due on the day of termination. So if I were to be fired today, I would receive today all wages that I earned up to and including today, as well as my accrued vacation. Now, when the employee quits, it gives us more time. So if they quit within 72 hours of letting us know, then also the final pay is due on the employee's last day of work. If the employee quits with less than 72 hours, then we have 72 hours to provide. Now, all of us are pretty much operating under point number 1, where the employer is making the decision to lay off and terminate the employee. So making that paycheck available and having that final paycheck available will oftentimes drive the timing of the layoff or termination. Now, with everybody working remotely and the shelter-in-place orders in place, it becomes even more challenging as to how are we going to get that final paycheck to the employee on the date that they're being terminated. Employers are getting very creative. Employers are utilizing Zoom to communicate to their employees. Some employers are mailing the checks and then terminating on the date that the check should be arriving in the mail. Some employers are actually having final paychecks hand delivered to the employees. There's a lot of different ways within which you can meet these requirements, but again, this is where legal counsel could come into play as well in helping you strategize. Now, if the final paycheck is late, what can happen is the employee can go to the labor commissioner's office and say that I didn't receive my final pay when due. And the penalty for that is a full day of wages for every day the paycheck is late up to 30 days. Those are called waiting time penalties. So some employers are being proactive. If they know that that final paycheck cannot get to that employee's hand on the date of termination, some employers are being proactive and paying those extra days that it will take for the final paycheck to get to the employee. So for example, if the employee was notified on Monday that they were terminated and Monday was their last day, but there was no way that the final paycheck could get to that employee on Monday, but it could get to that employee on Tuesday, then that final paycheck that arrives in the mail on Tuesday will include wages for Tuesday. So you're being proactive in paying that waiting time penalty as opposed to having that employee go to the labor commissioner's office, and then you have a claim with the labor commissioner's office, and that can open up a whole host of other issues that no employer wants to deal with, especially during right now. Okay, moving away from the final paycheck and leave versus furlough issue and on to the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And I'm just gonna see here if we had any questions in the queue on that yet. How can we stay informed of a ruling on changes to layoff final pay requirements? Okay, great. So we had a question here. How can we stay informed of a ruling on changes a layoff final pay requirement will be made? So the best way to stay informed, quite honestly, is Cal Chamber has a great blog. It's HR Watchdog blog post. We also have a podcast called The Workplace, and we are doing our best to try and get that information out to our employers, and those seem to be some of the quickest ways of getting the information out. The other place to go is to continue on a daily basis looking at the DLSC's website. That's dlsc.ca.gov. That's the Labor Commissioner's Office, and that website has COVID-19 specific links that you can go to, and that would also be a place where I would frequently visit. In fact, I go there every day to see whether any of the FAQs are did, whether there have been any changes. Everything is moving so quickly. Things continue to change by the hour sometimes. So it's just a good idea to try and stay up on some of those websites. Okay. We'll get to unemployment and EDD in a little bit. Let me just go through. I wanted to just also talk a little bit about the employer paid leave requirements that we now have under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And this is federal legislation that was passed at the beginning of the month. And I wanted to just touch base with it because at the Chamber, we've been getting a lot of calls or questions from employers about how this applies and how it relates to the other leave laws that are out there. So FFCRA is the acronym. It is, first of all, it's applicable to employers with fewer than 500 employees. So that's a significantly broad scope of employers. It's hitting on a number of larger employers, but we do know that there are employers that have more than 500. Those folks aren't affected by this federal legislation. Under the FFCRA, there's two different paid leave entitlements that employers need to offer to their employees. The one is an emergency sick leave. It's supplemental to what employers are already offering. And the other is an extended FMLA qualifying reason, if you will, and I'll talk a little bit about that. It's entitled, or those employees who are unable to work or telework because of the COVID-19 reasons specified are going to be entitled to these two leave buckets. There is an exclusion, and that is for emergency responders and healthcare providers. They are not entitled to these. Now, unlike other forms of leaves of absences that are mandated by the state or federal government that are paid, with this one, an employer may receive a tax credit from the IRS for any paid leave that the employer pays to employees under this program. As with the number of other laws that we have in California, as well as on the federal level, we have many poster requirements and notification requirements. This is no different. There is a separate FFCRA notice requirement that employers need to put along with all of their other postings in the workplace. And if we have folks that are working remotely and are not frequently visiting the workplace, we can go ahead and distribute it electronically through email or the intranet or what have you. So let's first talk about the emergency paid sick leave under the federal law. All employees who work for a covered employer are going to be eligible, meaning that there's no length of service requirement. So once the employee is hired and is working for the employer, they will be eligible assuming they meet one of the qualifying reasons. And speaking of qualifying reasons, under the emergency paid sick leave, the federal emergency paid sick leave, there are 6 qualifying reasons. While the employee is on emergency paid sick leave, their health insurance benefits continue. The maximum amount of time that an employee may receive the paid sick leave is a total of 80 hours. So that's up to 2 weeks of paid sick leave time. And again, this is in addition to any of our California state mandated sick leave requirements or local sick leave requirements, because many of us do fall under the local ordinances that actually require additional leave than what California state. So what are those qualifying reasons? And I have them color coded here because it will relate to how we pay for the different leaves, because the emergency paid sick leave is going to be paid at a higher rate than in an individual who is utilizing 12 weeks of expanded FMLA leave, which I'll talk about in a moment. So as far as the qualifying reasons, the first being the employee is subject to federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation orders related to COVID-19. The second reason is that the employee is advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine because of COVID-19. The third being that the employee is experiencing COVID-19 symptoms and is seeking a medical diagnosis. Fourth reason is that the employee is caring for an individual who is subject to an order described in 1. So they're caring for somebody who is subject to an isolation order, or they themselves are self-quarantined under number 2. So this is the employee caring for someone either under reason number 1 or reason number 2. The fifth reason is the employee is caring for a child whose school or place of care is closed or their child care provider is unavailable. So number 5 is probably a very common reason that I am sure many employers are dealing with right now, whether they themselves or whether they have employees who have children who are typically in school during the day, but because of school closures related to COVID-19 are now home learning and participating in distance learning. The sixth is the employees experiencing, and this is more of that catch-all reason, any other substantially similar conditions specified by the Secretary of Health and Human Services in consultation with the Secretaries of Labor and Treasury. So I mentioned before, as far as calculation of pay, for reasons 1, that's going to be the employee themselves are subject to a quarantine order. They've been advised by a health care provider, or they're seeking a medical diagnosis. They're going to be receiving their full wages based on their regular rate of pay. But it's capped not to exceed $511 per day, or a little over $5,000 in total. For reasons 4 and 6, and that is to care for somebody else, it's a nice way to look at it, or because that employee is home caring for a child who isn't sick but is home because their school is closed, then it's a little bit less money. The employee is paid at 2/3 of their wages based on their regular rate of pay. And the cap here is $200 per day and $2,000 total over that 2-week period. So again, if the employee is taking federal sick leave because they are sick or they're subject to an order or their medical provider has told them, then they're going to get paid out at that higher rate than if they're home caring for somebody else who's experiencing one of the qualifying reasons. The Emergency Family Medical Leave Act, this is a little bit different. So We have the Federal Family Leave Act, just to give you a little bit of background. And the FMLA, Federal Medical Leave Act, typically, well, in all cases except here, applies to employers with 50 or more employees. And in order for those employees to be eligible for FMLA, they need to meet certain qualifying factors. If they meet qualifying factors, then they're entitled to 12 weeks of protected leave. It is not paid. Welcome the emergency FMLA, which makes a few changes and says, okay, the emergency FMLA is going to apply to employers with less than 500 employees. So that means even employees that have employers who have never had to deal with FMLA because they have less than 50 are now going to have to embrace FMLA for this very limited purpose of emergency COVID-19 FMLA, if you will. And here, an eligible employee is one who worked for the employer for 30 days before the leave. And they get 12 weeks of job protected leave, which is paid after the first 10 days. So let's just take a step for a second. Emergency sick leave, there's no qualifying length of service, okay? So once the employee works for you, if they have any of those COVID-19 reasons, they're able to take that supplemental federal sick leave. Here under the emergency FMLA, that employee needs to have worked for the employer for 30 days before the leave was to begin. Other thing, emergency paid sick leave, we know all maximum 2-week time is going to be paid depending upon the reason. Here, pay for the first 10 days is not going to happen under the FMLA. It's 12 weeks of protected leave paid after the first 10 days. Now let's talk about what the qualifying reason is for EFMLA. It's one reason and one reason only, and that's because the employee is unable to work or telework because they must care for their son or daughter who is home because their school or place of care is closed to COVID-19. And it's also worth noting that the son or daughter is under the age of 18 unless that son or daughter has a disability and cannot care for themselves. Okay, so take a quick step back. We know that under sick leave, we have the qualifying reason under 5 that the employee is caring for a child who is home because their school has been closed. This is the same reason for which an employee can take 12 weeks of protected leave under FMLA. So why did they do that? How does this work? That means that an employee can use their 2 weeks of sick leave that's paid to care for a child who is no longer in school because of school closure, and then also pick up on the remaining FMLA time. So what that means is they're going to have 12 weeks under EFMLA. The first 2 weeks can be paid out through the federal sick leave. The remaining time would be paid out through FMLA. That's why the first 10 days of EFMLA is not paid, because the employee could use their sick leave. FMLA pay, like I said here, the first 10 days are unpaid, but the employee can elect to use their emergency sick leave. The employee can also elect to use accrued PTO, vacation, or other leave. So it's up to the employee. The employer cannot require. As far as the remaining time, it is compensated at that reduced rate of 2/3 of the employee's regular rate, capped at $200 per day and $10,000 in total. So $10,000 for the entire duration of the EFMLA. Now this is based on the calculation based on a full-time employee. A part-time employee, there's different calculation methods that are outlined in the regulations. Small business exception. I wanted to raise this because I would imagine that a number of businesses that are dialing in today are considered smaller. And of course, this is a significant hit to employers. Even though you can receive a payroll tax credit from the IRS, you're still being expected to front load the pay, so to speak. The tax credit comes in after. So with the small business exception, that applies to employers with fewer than 50 employees. So that's how the federal government has defined small business. It is only applicable to leave for reasons of caring for a child if their school or place of care is closed. So it's very limited to that care because a child is home due to school closure. The threshold question with the small business exception is whether extending such leave would jeopardize the viability of the small business as a going concern. Now, the authorized officer of a business must document and certify that the business will be jeopardized based on specific factors that are set forth in the regulation. And what the authorized officer of the business has to determine is a couple of factors in the regulation, including providing such leave would result in the small business's expenses and financial obligations exceeding available business revenues and cause the small business to cease operating at minimal capability. And there's a couple of other factors that are outlined in the regulation and also available on some resources that I have here at the end of the presentation. You do not need to send any documentation to the Department of Labor, but you do need to have the documentation so that if questioned, you are able to demonstrate why you met that small business exception. Couple of helpful resources here. The California Chamber of Commerce, we do have a COVID-19 resources page that does have information about everything that I've just talked about today. The state of California also has an excellent resource page. The EDD is a great resource page to look at when we're talking about unemployment benefits. And then the U.S. Department of Labor, the link here is where you're going to go to any FAQs related to the federal emergency sick and FMLA leave, as well as other helpful FAQs. They have a number of FAQs that are aimed to address a number of these issues. Okay, so let me see here about questions. Okie dokie, let's see.
So Erica, I'm going to add Cherie back on as well. I'm going to ask her to start her video.
Okay, great.
You should get her any minute. There she is.
Hi, Cherie.
Hi.
Let's see here. Cherie, I see here there's a question that you can answer. I've applied for unemployment, but have not received any update. What do I do?
Yeah, so I was actually wanting to enter the answer to that by text because there's a URL I wanted to share. But
Okay.
if you've not received response within 10 days, do go to the EDD website online and I'll post what that is. You need to contact them online, by mail, or by phone and ask, because you should receive notice within 10 days.
And Cherie, this is Amanda. I'm going to send out a follow-up email to all the attendees. So if you want to share any links with me that you want to share with folks, I can get it sent to everyone who's attending.
There's another question here. I think it's more about the emotional toll that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the workplace, and what types of resources employees or employers can provide to their employees. Some employers do have employee assistance programs that can help. Some employers have been very proactive at sending helpful articles to their employees. There's lots of helpful tips out there on how to stay engaged, how to stay focused while remote working, focusing on the positive, staying away from social media. So there is a lot of helpful information out there that employers can certainly take a look at and pass along to employees as they feel is appropriate. The COVID-19 Families First notice, that is the only notice requirement that is existing right now. However, I do want to mention that yesterday, Governor Newsom did issue an executive order that extends California supplemental COVID-19 sick leave that applies for basically employers in the food sector industry who have 500 or more employees. So it's trying to fill that gap left by the federal government, and it entitles specific food sector employees up to 80 hours of supplemental sick leave at the state level. And a notice will be required under that new order as well, but the notice will not be available for another week or so. The Labor Commissioner's Office is putting it out. A question with regards to the small business exception. It is not a blanket exception. What I mean by that is just because you are a small business with 50 employees or less that you are excluded from having to offer the sick leave in the EFMLA. It's only limited to the qualifying reason of an employee who needs time away, child is home due to a school closure, and you do need to meet the requirements that are outlined by the regulations. Sherry, did you want to step in and take any of these or talk a little bit and then we can come back? How do you want to do that?
I did want to add to the question regarding, how to support employees during this time. Is everybody, can everybody hear me okay?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So I just wanted to make employers aware, just be careful of offering, for example, having a masseuse come in and provide services or things like that, that there are things that the IRS will consider to be taxable. So just be aware on extra services that are being provided, that the benefits such as that are considered, unfortunately, taxable wages. Yeah.
That's good. Good to know. Let's see here. Period of reason I believe is followed by layoffs. Okay, so excellent question concerning, I want to say this is just going to concern layoffs in general and those in a protected class. It's focused here on you can lay somebody off who's on an EFMLA. And the issue with layoffs and concerns over individuals who maybe are on a protected leave, such as FMLA, is you just want to make sure that there's a legitimate business purpose or necessity for conducting the layoff. So the question that I always have employers ask themselves is, had this person not been on a leave, would you still be laying them off? And if the answer is yes, then generally that means there is a legitimate business reason for which the layoff and that person is being laid off, having nothing to do with the fact that that employee is on a protected leave of absence. With that being said, it is always a good idea to check with legal counsel, particularly when your layoff may include somebody who's on a protected leave. Excellent question as far as compelling employees to use their PTO. So remember, under California's mandatory sick leave, as well as many of the local ordinances throughout the state of California, it's up to the employee to choose to use sick leave. With PTO is a umbrella term that I like to describe it as, which includes vacation and sick. But for purposes of the mandatory sick leave law, the Labor Commissioner looks at the PTO policy as the sick leave policy. And the reason that I mention that is requiring an employee to use PTO, which encompasses your sick leave, is not going to be allowed under the state law. The employee gets to decide. The employer cannot force the employer to utilize it, and it certainly can't force the employee to utilize it before dipping into the emergency sick leave bucket that's been established here. Cherie, we have a question with regards to EDD paying benefits for the 2 weeks. Do you see that question right there?
Is it the last one?
Second to last, I think.
Oh, okay, let's see. I have not received anything in the mail. Yeah, we are experiencing extreme delays with EDD. We're noticing that a lot. Again, I'll post the only information that we have from EDD, where to contact them, both online, by mail, or by phone. But you're saying that you haven't received anything by mail, and again, that we only have those 3 resources available. I think they're just swamped and a bit behind.
Hey guys, this is Amanda. Real quick, I just wanted to ask you to make sure to read all the questions out loud for the audience before you answer them. Just thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this question was about, having not heard back from the EDD, and it's been since April 11th, I guess was the date on that one. That went away. Where'd it go?
Hey guys, Sherry, we're hearing that people can't hear you very well. Could you maybe speak up or move a little closer to your mic?
Sure, I'll give that a try here. Also wanted to respond to the question about being self-employed and being able to file for unemployment. And yes, as part of the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Relief and Economic Security Act, they are having the ability for self-employed, and there are some questions on, how is the amount of wages determined? And there is a list of questions when you go to EDD and file for that. You'll see specifically for self-employed, and you have to answer those questions to help you determine what the wages are.
And just to add to that, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but are you talking about the pandemic unemployment insurance program? Is that?
This is unemployment insurance for self-employed. So similar to employees being able to file for unemployment insurance, self-employed being able to file.
Okay, thank you.
Which is not normally allowed because there's no employer paying paying unemployment insurance for you.
Right, and it's, oh, go ahead, Erica.
Yeah, so it is the pandemic unemployment assistance is what it's being called. EDD's website just updated their information earlier this week. It looks like the state of California will begin accepting applications for that. I believe it was, yes, April 28th is when the state will begin accepting applications. I would, for those of you that are interested who are self-employed, independent contractors who are looking for some assistance right now, I would continue checking with the EDD's website because, as Sherry said, they are listing what they're phasing it over time and how much you will be able to collect depending upon when your claim is made, or basically when your loss began. And so that's something that I would continue to check on.
It looks like the one's already been answered about the emergency paid leave with less than 50 employees. I think you answered that already.
I did, yeah. One of the concerns from a lot of employers is the concern that the employee is going to use the leave and then take off or resign. And that is always, unfortunately, that's a concern that exists, whether we're in COVID-19 or not, of employees utilizing the paid time and then resigning. And I think that's just, unfortunately, sometimes it happens, but I think for the most part, especially during this time, employees are wanting to get back to work. They're wanting to be able to have their lives restored, and hopefully are not taking advantage of the leave options that are there for those that need it.
You should be able to fairly immediately recoup any of that time taken if you're using a payroll service provider.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them are allowing that money to immediately come out of the money that's being impounded for federal Social Security immediately. So yeah, you should be able to recoup that money fairly quickly.
There was a question as far as how it works when you apply for EDD. So the EDD website, edd.ca.gov, they have a very easily navigatable website that will walk you through the application process. They prefer that the application be filed online. As you can imagine, over the last several weeks, they've just been flooded with applications and claims. They are a bit behind on getting the money out. Last I heard, they were about 3 weeks behind. But if you're patient with the process, you will be able to get through and get your application in and see the benefits in a few weeks.
And Erica, correct me if I'm wrong, but I see a question regarding an employee's unemployment insurance being affected by sick leave. And if you have laid off an employee and they're collecting unemployment insurance, they are not any longer available to receive any emergency sick leave.
That's right. So remember, with the emergency sick leave, they're either unable to work or telework. And yes, if they're recovering UI benefits, then they're not working and not entitled to get the sick leave.
Small business loans, the PPP, yeah, as I understand it, as of right now, SBA is no longer accepting applications for PPP. They're trying to get additional funding, but currently no additional applications are being accepted.
Yeah, I can also answer a little bit about that. Yeah, as Sheree was saying, both PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, and the Economic Injury Disaster Loans have run out of funding. We are hoping that a new funding bill will be passed and they will be refunded again soon, but until that happens, we do have on the city's website with resources for businesses, we do have a list of potential places to get loans. There are some programs through the state of California, for example, through our iBank, that are still providing loans to small businesses. So I will send out that link to you all in the follow-up email.
Oh, this is a great question. Are employers required to have the FFCRA paid sick leave balance displayed on check stubs? Particularly for part-time employees, it could be difficult because of the requirement to calculate the average hours worked. Thank you for submitting this question. Yes, we don't have an answer to that yet. It's not specified. I don't know, Sheree, if you have any thoughts on that. We know that under California's mandatory sick leave, you do need to list on the paycheck the balance that's available. I think a lot of employers are just following that same practice. I don't know what you have to say about that, Sheree.
Yeah, with the actual pay stub, we're not seeing that being a requirement, though the ability to provide the balance to employees is really the key. The fact that it's on the pay stub, that's not currently being required. Most everyone uses automated systems these days, and that would require some change to technology. So yeah, just be able to provide it if requested. And
I do know that a number of payroll service providers have made adjustments to their programs and are equipped and ready to handle the calculation and the disbursement of the emergency sick leave under federal law.
mm-hmm.
So do folks have other questions that they want to submit? Now is definitely the time. Oh, we have another question about the PPP, if sole proprietors can apply. You know what, I'm going to give you a typed answer with my email address, and if you can send me that question via email, I will respond and let you know the answer to that. So I'm going to just give my email address here, which is econdev@alamedaca.gov. Okay. Erica and Sheree, are you seeing these other two questions that just came in?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm reading the last one. So Erica will probably want to chime in on that last one, but in general, from an HR perspective, we actually don't ever recommend loaning money to employees. It's not an ideal practice. In fact, it's probably best if you have it in your employee handbook that that's not a company policy to do that. And
there is no program that would forgive that loan. I think what you might have heard is that you could then later apply funds that you received through, for example, the PPP to that, and maybe that's what the person was referring to. But there's no program that would forgive any loan to an employee.
Yeah, Cherie, that's absolutely 100% right. And in fact, it's actually the Department of the Labor Commissioner's Office would come down pretty hard. They don't favor employers. Well, let me put it this way. An employer is not a bank. If they choose to loan the employee the money, they cannot pay themselves back through a payroll deduction. So it's always risky when employers are loaning money to their employees because it's difficult to get that money back.
Yeah, even if the employee says, I'm okay with you deducting it
Yep.
from my check, yeah, it's not a good idea to do that. And I have found cases where an employee then leaves and you have no right to deduct that from their final pay. You know, if you agreed on $50 per paycheck and now they still owe you $1,000, you cannot deduct that final $1,000 from their paycheck by law.
Yep, that's absolutely correct.
An anonymous viewer asked about how does it work when applying for EDD. I assume that means for unemployment insurance. And I have been a bit frustrated. I will say I've helped several clients' employees through that process, and the questions aren't written in a way that is extremely understandable at times. So do be careful and seek other people who have gone through the process, their advice on answering those questions.
All right, so I think we're starting to get to the end of our time here. Guys, were there any other questions that you want to answer now, or should I get started on our wrap up? I want to be cognizant of your time.
Yeah, I think we answered that one.
Yeah, I think we're good.
All right. Well, so I want to say a big thank you to Erica and Cherie for joining us. Cherie, I forgot to mention when I introduced her, in addition to being on the board of directors for the Chamber of Commerce, is the president of the Greater Alameda Business Association as well. And I also wanted to thank, we have been partnering with the business associations here in the city of Alameda. We've partnered with the Chamber on this webinar. We're working with the West Alameda Business Association, the Downtown Alameda Business Association, and the Greater Alameda Business Association to bring these webinars and this information to Alameda businesses. So for those of you who are asking questions about SBA loans, like PPE loans and the economic injury disaster loans, there will be a webinar on Monday with a representative from the SBA who can answer any and all of your questions about those loans. There's also going to be a town hall on Tuesday for Alameda businesses with city staff. And then there's a whole slate of amazing webinars that are going to be coming up next week. I'm just pulling those up here. Including a webinar with the folks from SCORE, our local business counseling organization, on how to navigate different programs for businesses in this time, and then a conversation with the IRS next Friday. So I am going to put, in my follow-up email to you guys, I'm going to send you all the information on these webinars so you can stay up to date as we're all kind of navigating this uncertain time. So thank you again so much for joining us. And we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.